In the heart of Silicon Valley, where dreams were built on microchips and lines of code, a remarkable story unfolded that would shake the foundations of both the tech and aviation industries. At the center of this tale was a woman who had defied every odd stacked against her, not just as a female entrepreneur, but as a black woman in an industry dominated by a very different demographic. She started her journey in a small apartment above her grandmother's garage, surrounded by second-hand computers she'd pieced together from spare parts. While other kids played video games, she was learning to code, staying up late into the night as the blue light from her monitor illuminated her determined face. Her grandmother would often bring her cups of hot chocolate, gently reminding her to get some sleep, but she knew this was more than just a hobby. It was her future. Her first breakthrough came during her college years when she developed a revolutionary data compression algorithm. Instead of selling it to the highest bidder, she did something different. She built her own company around it. The early days were tough. She remembers sleeping on an air mattress in her tiny office, eating instant noodles, and pitching her ideas to investors who often couldn't see past their own biases. But she had something they couldn't ignore: pure talent and unstoppable drive. Her software solution was simply better than anything else on the market. One by one, major companies started adopting her technology. What began as a small startup with 3 employees grew into a tech powerhouse, employing thousands across the globe. 20 years later, she had transformed that small compression algorithm into a multi-billion-dollar empire. Her company didn't just make software anymore. They were pioneers in cloud computing, artificial intelligence, and data security. Every major tech company wanted to partner with her, and every startup wanted to be her. The media loved to focus on the numbers: the billions in revenue, the thousands of employees, the multiple headquarters across 3 continents. But she never forgot her roots. She still kept that very first computer in her office, a reminder of where it all began. She made it a point to mentor young tech entrepreneurs, particularly those from underrepresented backgrounds. Her company was known for having one of the most diverse workforces in Silicon Valley, and she took pride in creating opportunities for people who reminded her of herself at the start of her journey. On this particular morning, she was preparing for what should have been a routine trip. Her company was about to launch a major new product line, and she needed to personally oversee the final preparations at their San Francisco office. She'd made this Atlanta to San Francisco trip countless times before. The only difference was that this time, she was flying her company's newly acquired private jet, a purchase she'd made not out of vanity, but necessity, given her increasingly demanding schedule. The jet was a sleek Gulfstream G650, top of the line in private aviation. She'd chosen it carefully, considering not just luxury but efficiency and environmental impact. What she didn't know as she drove to the private terminal that morning, dressed in her usual elegant but understated style, was that this flight would become about much more than just getting from point A to point B. As she pulled up to the private terminal in her electric vehicle, she noticed something felt different. Maybe it was the way the ground crew paused a beat too long when they saw her, or how the atmosphere shifted when she walked into the terminal. After 2 decades in the tech industry, she developed a sixth sense for when something wasn't quite right. She'd faced plenty of prejudice and discrimination on her way to the top, but she'd always handled it with grace and strategic precision. Little did she know, she was about to face one of the most blatant challenges of her career, one that would not only test her resolve, but would end up changing the aviation industry forever. Her assistant, walking a few steps behind with their tablets and briefcases, would later say that something in the air felt charged that morning, like the calm before a storm. They had no idea just how prophetic that feeling would turn out to be. The morning sun cast long shadows across the private terminal's polished floor as she approached the check-in counter. Everything about her spoke of quiet confidence, from her well-tailored business suit to the way she carried herself. She'd done this hundreds of times before, but today would be different. The pilot was already waiting in the terminal. He stood there in his crisp uniform, captain's stripes gleaming on his shoulders, looking every bit the part of a seasoned aviator. But something in his expression changed the moment he saw her walk through the door. His eyes narrowed, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'll need to see some identification," he announced, his voice carrying across the quiet terminal. This wasn't unusual. Safety protocols were important in private aviation. What was unusual was his tone, and the fact that he hadn't even bothered with a greeting. She reached into her bag and pulled out her credentials, along with the flight manifest. "Of course," she replied smoothly, maintaining her professional demeanor. "I'm the owner of the aircraft. Everything's been filed and cleared for takeoff." The pilot barely glanced at the documents. "And how exactly did you come to own this aircraft?" he asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. "These are very expensive planes. Very complex machines." Her assistant, standing nearby, couldn't believe what she was hearing. Everyone in the tech industry knew who her boss was. Her face had been on the cover of every major business magazine. Her company's logo was probably on half the devices in that very terminal. "I'm well aware of the aircraft's value and specifications," she responded calmly. "I chose this model specifically for its range and fuel efficiency. Now, shall we review the flight plan?" But the pilot wasn't finished. He began questioning her about every technical detail of the aircraft, clearly trying to trip her up. With each question, his tone grew more condescending. When she answered each query with expert knowledge, his frustration became increasingly evident. "Listen," he said, leaning forward slightly. "I've been flying these routes for 20 years. I know all the regular clients, and I'd never seen you before." The terminal had grown quiet. The ground crew had stopped what they were doing, watching the scene unfold. Even the coffee machine behind the counter seemed to have stopped its usual gurgling. She took a deep breath, centering herself. In her 20 years of building her tech empire, she'd faced prejudice in many forms. The subtle kind that came wrapped in polite smiles, and the blatant kind that didn't bother with disguise. This was clearly the latter. "Let me be clear," she said, her voice firm but controlled. "I am the owner of this aircraft. My flight plan has been filed and approved. My credentials are in order. If you have concerns about my qualifications to own this aircraft, you're welcome to contact my company's legal department." The pilot's face flushed red. He began shuffling through the papers again, making a show of scrutinizing every detail. His hands were shaking slightly. Whether from anger or embarrassment wasn't clear. Her assistant had already pulled out a phone and was quietly recording the interaction. Years of experience had taught them all that documentation was often necessary in these situations. The quiet whir of security cameras overhead added to the tension in the air. What happened next would later be viewed millions of times online. The pilot, perhaps realizing he was being recorded, decided to double down rather than back down. He began loudly questioning not just her ownership of the plane, but her right to be in the private terminal at all. The situation was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. But instead of losing her composure, she did what she'd done countless times in boardrooms and business negotiations. She prepared to turn a challenge into an opportunity for change. The private terminal had become eerily quiet, except for the pilot's increasingly hostile voice echoing off the marble floors. What he didn't realize was that his career-ending moment was being captured from multiple angles. The assistant's phone was steadily recording, its red light blinking silently in the tense atmosphere. "I've been flying VIPs longer than you've probably owned a car," the pilot sneered, his professionalism completely abandoned. "And I've never had someone like you claim to own one of these jets." The word "you" carried so much weight it seemed to hang in the air. Other passengers in the terminal had stopped pretending not to watch. A young ground crew member looked uncomfortable, shifting from foot to foot, clearly torn between wanting to help and fearing for his job. The tech mogul quietly pressed the record button on her own phone, laying it casually on the counter. Years of experience had taught her the value of documentation. She'd built her empire on being prepared, on thinking 3 steps ahead. This moment would be no different. "Someone like me?" she asked calmly, her voice level but firm. "I'd be very interested to hear exactly what you mean by that." She was giving him rope, and he was about to hang himself with it. The pilot, caught up in his own prejudices, didn't notice how several staff members had also pulled out their phones. In the age of social media, bad behavior rarely went undocumented. His next words would soon be played in boardrooms, courtrooms, and living rooms across the country. "Listen here," he started, his face reddening further. "I've flown celebrities, CEOs, real business people. They don't look like." He caught himself, but it was too late. The damage was done, and every word was preserved digitally. The assistant, still recording, had already sent a message to the company's legal team. Within minutes, responses started flooding in. The legal department had been waiting for something like this, not hoping for it, but prepared. They'd seen too many similar incidents in other settings. What made this recording particularly powerful wasn't just what was being said, but the stark contrast in behavior. On one side, a highly accomplished business leader maintaining perfect composure while being openly discriminated against. On the other, a supposedly professional pilot becoming increasingly unhinged simply because he couldn't accept the reality in front of him. The security cameras overhead continued their silent vigil, adding another layer of documentation to the unfolding scene. Later, when the footage was compiled, it would provide a damning picture from every angle. A young woman working at the coffee counter had tears in her eyes as she watched. She would later share with investigators that she'd seen similar behavior from this pilot before, but no one had ever challenged him. No one had ever been powerful enough to do so. The tech leader noticed the coffee counter worker's distress, making a mental note. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. This was about a pattern, about systemic issues that needed to be addressed. Every detail captured on these recordings would help paint that bigger picture. "I want to make sure I understand correctly," she said, her voice still calm, but now carrying an edge of steel. "Are you refusing to fly this aircraft because of who you think I am, rather than what my credentials show?" The pilot's response, captured in high-definition video and crystal-clear audio, would become a textbook example of what not to do in professional settings. His words, dripping with prejudice, would later be played in sensitivity training sessions across the aviation industry. What he didn't know was that his outburst wasn't just being recorded by the phones visible in the terminal. The tech leader's company had developed some of the most sophisticated audio enhancement software in the world. Every nuance, every muttered comment, every subtle inflection would be preserved with perfect clarity. As the situation continued to escalate, more witnesses arrived at the terminal. Each new person who walked in immediately sensed the tension and, almost instinctively, reached for their phones. By the time the pilot finished his tirade, his behavior had been documented from nearly every angle in the room. Moments like these define a person's character. Standing in that private terminal, surrounded by the weight of prejudice, the tech leader made a decision that would ripple through the aviation industry. She straightened her blazer, a subtle gesture that spoke volumes about her resolve. "Let me be perfectly clear about what's happening here," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had built an empire from scratch. "Every word you've spoken, every action you've taken, has been recorded. Not just by our phones, but by the terminal's security systems." The pilot's face flickered with the first hint of uncertainty. He glanced around, suddenly aware of the many eyes and cameras focused on him. The ground crew had stopped pretending to work. The coffee counter staff stood frozen. Everyone knew they were witnessing something important. She pulled out her phone and made a call, putting it on speaker. "This is the CEO. I need the board on an emergency conference call, and get our legal team ready." Her voice was steady, controlled, the voice of someone used to handling crisis. The pilot's demeanor shifted slightly. Perhaps for the first time, He was beginning to realize who he was actually dealing with. But pride and prejudice are stubborn things, and he couldn't quite bring himself to back down. "You can't threaten me," he said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "I have rights too." "Yes, you do," she replied calmly. "And you've exercised your right to show exactly who you are. Now I'm going to exercise my rights as a business owner, an American citizen, and a human being deserving of basic respect." Her assistant was already coordinating with airport security, who had finally been alerted to the situation. But the tech leader wasn't finished. She turned to address the small crowd that had gathered. "If anyone else has experienced similar treatment here, now is the time to speak up," she announced. "My legal team will ensure your protection." Her words carried the weight of someone who had the resources to back them up. Several people stepped forward almost immediately. The young woman from the coffee counter, a maintenance worker, even one of the security guards. Each had a story to tell, and each story painted a picture of systematic discrimination that had gone unchallenged for too long. The pilot's face grew paler with each person who stepped forward. His earlier bravado crumbled as he realized the situation had grown far beyond a single confrontation. She pulled out a business card and handed it to the coffee counter worker. "My office will be in touch. Your courage in speaking up matters." The young woman's hands trembled as she took the card, but her eyes shone with determination. Airport management had arrived by this point, profusely apologizing and trying to smooth things over. But the tech leader held up her hand. "This isn't something that can be smoothed over with apologies," she stated firmly. "This requires action, change, and accountability." She turned to her assistant. "Send copies of all recordings to our secure server. Then contact every major aviation authority. This stops today." Her words weren't just about one incident anymore. They were about changing an entire industry's culture. The terminal had become crowded now. Other pilots, ground crew, and passengers had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Some looked uncomfortable, others nodding in approval. Change was happening in real time, sparked by one person's refusal to accept discrimination. "You had a choice this morning," she addressed the pilot one final time. "You could have checked my credentials, confirmed my identity, and proceeded professionally. Instead, you chose to make assumptions based on how I look. That choice will have consequences." As she spoke these words, her phone buzzed continuously with messages from board members, legal advisors, and aviation authorities. The wheels of justice were already turning, set in motion by one woman's decision to take a stand. The story broke like a thunderstorm across social media. Within hours of the incident, the recordings went viral, sparking a nationwide conversation. But what happened next would reveal something even more troubling. This wasn't just about one pilot or one incident. As investigators began digging deeper, they uncovered a pattern that stretched back years. The aviation company's internal emails told a disturbing story. Complaints had been filed before, tucked away in forgotten folders, marked resolved, without any real action taken. The young woman from the coffee counter wasn't alone. Her testimony opened the floodgates. Former employees started coming forward, sharing similar experiences. Some had quit their jobs rather than face daily discrimination. Others had been pushed out after speaking up. "I never thought anyone would believe me," said one former ground crew member during an interview. "When you're working class, going up against powerful people seems impossible. But watching her stand up to that pilot gave me courage." The investigation team, led by one of the country's top civil rights attorneys, worked methodically through the evidence. They found flight logs showing patterns of unavailable pilots when certain clients booked flights. They uncovered casual discriminatory comments in work chat groups, the picture growing clearer with each passing day. The tech leader's own security team, experts in digital forensics, joined the investigation. They recovered deleted emails and reconstructed conversations that some had tried to hide. Their findings would later become part of a larger report that would shake the private aviation industry to its core. One particularly powerful piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. A retired flight attendant had kept a detailed diary of incidents she'd witnessed over her 20-year career. She'd been too afraid to speak up while working, but now, seeing others come forward, she knew it was time to share her story. "I'd watched them turn away qualified pilots because they didn't fit the image," she revealed. "I saw talented ground crew passed over for promotions because of how they looked. I wrote it all down, hoping someday someone would care enough to listen." The tech leader's legal team worked around the clock, gathering testimonies and building a case that would be impossible to ignore. But they weren't just building a lawsuit. They were creating a blueprint for industry-wide change. Airport security footage from the past 5 years was reviewed, showing countless subtle and not-so-subtle instances of discrimination. The tech leader's software company developed an AI program to analyze the footage, identifying patterns that human reviewers might have missed. The investigation reached beyond just one airport or one company. Other private aviation firms were put under the microscope. Industry practices that had been accepted as standard for years were suddenly being questioned and examined. "We knew things weren't right," said an air traffic controller who'd worked at the airport for 15 years. But until now, nobody powerful enough to make changes had experienced it firsthand. Sometimes it takes someone with resources to shine a light on what the rest of us have been seeing in the shadows. The pilot's own record came under scrutiny. His personnel file revealed previous incidents that had been dismissed or downplayed. Coworkers began sharing stories of comments he'd made, actions he'd taken, all building a picture of long-term problematic behavior that had gone unchecked. As the investigation expanded, it began to uncover industry-wide issues. Training programs were reviewed, hiring practices examined, and promotion patterns analyzed. The data painted a clear picture of systemic problems that went far beyond any single incident. The tech leader had sparked something bigger than she'd initially intended. What started as standing up to one pilot's discrimination had become a movement for change in an industry that had managed to avoid serious scrutiny for decades. The video of the confrontation did more than just go viral. It became a turning point. Major news networks picked up the story, not just because it involved a famous tech leader, but because it touched a nerve in the national conversation of workplace discrimination. The impact hit the aviation industry like a shockwave. Private jet companies suddenly found themselves under intense public scrutiny. Their websites, usually showcasing luxurious cabins and smiling crew members, now featured hastily added statements about diversity and inclusion. "I've been watching these companies scramble to change their image," said one industry veteran, a flight scheduler with 30 years of experience. "But this time, it's different. This time, they can't just put a Band-Aid on it and hope people forget." The tech leader's own company took an unexpected step. They announced they would develop free software for aviation companies to track and address discrimination complaints. It was more than just a database. It was a complete system that made it impossible to bury or ignore reports of unfair treatment. Flight schools saw a surge in applications from diverse candidates. Many cited the viral video as their inspiration. "Watching her stand up to that pilot made me realize I belonged in the cockpit too," shared a young flight student. "If she could own the plane, I could definitely fly it." Aviation industry conferences, usually focused on technical innovations and luxury services, suddenly added new panel discussions. Topics like creating an inclusive aviation culture and addressing bias in flight operations became central rather than sidebar conversations. The biggest changes came from inside the industry itself. Pilots, flight attendants, and ground crew who had stayed quiet for years began speaking up. They shared their stories in break rooms, in online forums, and in formal complaints. The dam of silence had broken. "We used to just accept certain things as how it is," explained a veteran flight attendant. "But after seeing that video, people started asking why. Why do we accept this? Why don't we demand better?" Large airlines started reviewing their own practices, worried they might face similar scrutiny. Training programs were overhauled. Hiring panels were diversified. Employee feedback systems were strengthened. The ripple effect touched every corner of the industry. The tech leader's involvement brought something new to the conversation: technology. Her company developed AI tools to analyze patterns in hiring, promotion, and complaint handling. These tools made it harder to hide systematic discrimination behind paperwork and procedures. Young people watching this unfold saw something powerful. They saw change happening in real time. Aviation clubs in high schools and colleges reported increased interest from students who had never considered aviation careers before. My daughter watched that video and asked me why there weren't more pilots who looked like her, shared a flying instructor. For the first time, I could tell her things were actually changing, not just promise that they would someday. The financial impact was significant too. Companies known for discriminatory practices saw their stock prices fall. Clients began asking questions about diversity policies before booking private flights. Corporate contracts started including clauses about inclusive practices. Perhaps most importantly, the incident sparked conversations in cockpits, hangars, and flight lounges across the country. Veteran pilots talked with newer ones about responsibility and respect. Ground crew members shared experiences they'd never voiced before. The industry's culture was shifting, one conversation at a time. Even the old-timers who had initially resisted change began to see its value. "I've been flying for 40 years," said one retired captain. "And I finally realized that making the industry more welcoming doesn't take anything away from what I've achieved. It just means more people get the chance to achieve it too." The courthouse steps were crowded that morning. People who'd never been interested in aviation industry lawsuits found themselves drawn to this case. It wasn't just about one incident anymore. It had become about something much bigger. The tech leader's legal team arrived carrying boxes of evidence. Inside were thousands of pages of testimony, emails, and company records. But what made this case different was the human stories behind every document. Each page represented someone who'd finally found the courage to speak up. "I never thought I'd see this day," whispered one former flight attendant to another as they waited to testify. "For years, we just accepted things as they were. Now look at all these people here to support change." The aviation company's lawyers tried to settle quietly at first. They offered a substantial sum of money, hoping to make the problem go away. But the tech leader wasn't interested in a payoff. She wanted something more valuable than money. She wanted real change. Inside the courtroom, the evidence was overwhelming. The recordings from that day played on large screens, crystal clear thanks to the tech leader's company's advanced audio enhancement software. But it was the pattern of behavior that came after that really caught everyone's attention. When I reported similar incidents, they told me I was being too sensitive, testified one ground crew member. They said I should focus on doing my job and stop causing trouble. As he spoke, heads nodded in the gallery. His story was all too familiar to many. The defense tried to paint the pilot's behavior as an isolated incident. But then came the emails, the internal memos, the hidden patterns in scheduling and assignments. Year after year of complaints that had been brushed aside or buried in paperwork. The tech leader's testimony was particularly powerful. She spoke not just about her own experience, but about the responsibility that came with her position. "I could have just found another pilot," she said. "I could have used my resources to avoid this problem. But that would have meant leaving the problem in place for others to face." During breaks in the trial, small groups gathered in the courthouse hallways, sharing their own stories. Some had flown together for years without knowing they'd faced similar treatment. The case was bringing people together, creating connections and solidarity where there had been silence. The company's own records became their undoing. Years of documented discrimination, hidden in plain sight among routine paperwork. The tech leader's team had developed special software to analyze these patterns, making them impossible to ignore. "Look at these numbers," the lead attorney said, pointing to a chart. When certain pilots were on duty, specific clients were mysteriously rerouted or rescheduled. This wasn't random. This was systematic. As the trial continued, more companies in the industry started making changes, not waiting to be forced by the courts. They hired diversity consultants, updated their training programs, and created new reporting systems. Nobody wanted to be the next company in the headlines. The pilot himself finally took the stand. His testimony was different from his behavior that day. Face to face with the consequences of his actions, seeing the hurt he caused laid bare in the courtroom, something seemed to shift. His arrogance was replaced with what appeared to be genuine remorse. What made this case special wasn't just the high profile of the tech leader or the dramatic evidence. It was the way it gave voice to hundreds of others who'd faced similar treatment. Each testimony built on the last, creating a picture that couldn't be ignored or explained away. By the final day of arguments, the courtroom was packed. People stood along the walls, some having traveled from other states to witness this moment. They weren't just there to see justice served in one case. They were there to see an industry forced to face its problems and change. The final hearing day arrived with an atmosphere of anticipation. The courthouse was packed, with people spilling out into the hallways. Everyone knew this wasn't just about winning a case. It was about changing an entire industry. The tech leader sat calmly at the front of the courtroom, the same quiet strength about her that she'd shown that day at the airport. She turned down 3 settlement offers, each one larger than the last. Her response had been the same each time. This isn't about money. It's about making sure this never happens to anyone else. When the judge began reading the verdict, you could hear a pin drop. The ruling was comprehensive. The aviation company was found liable not just for the pilot's actions, but for years of overlooking similar incidents. The financial penalties were significant, but the mandated changes were even more important. The court orders a complete overhaul of training procedures, the judge announced. All staff, from pilots to ground crew, must complete enhanced anti-discrimination training. The company must establish clear reporting procedures for any incidents of bias or discrimination. But the tech leader wasn't finished. She stood up and addressed the court. "Your Honor, I'd like to propose something additional." She outlined a plan that surprised everyone. Instead of keeping the settlement money, she wanted to create an industry-wide training program. The young woman from the coffee counter, who'd been brave enough to speak up that first day, was crying quietly in the gallery. "I never thought anyone would believe us," she whispered to her colleague. "I never thought anything would change." The pilot, who'd sparked all this with his actions, asked to speak. His voice was different now, humbled, changed. "I've learned more in these past months than in all my years of flying," he admitted. "I didn't see my own biases until they were played back for me in that video. I'm not proud of what I did, but I'm committed to doing better." The judge's final order included something unprecedented. The company had to install special software, developed by the tech leader's team, to track and analyze all complaints and incidents. No more buried reports. No more ignored voices. Outside the courthouse, a group of young aviation students had gathered. They held signs reading "Thank you for opening the skies" and "Change is possible." Many of them shared how this case had given them hope for their own futures in aviation. The tech leader spoke briefly to the press afterward, but her most important words were for the group of industry workers who'd come forward to testify. "Your courage made this possible," she told them. "This victory belongs to all of you." The impact was immediate. Other aviation companies started calling, wanting to implement the new training programs before they faced similar lawsuits. Industry leaders who'd been quiet during the trial suddenly became vocal advocates for change. The pilot's aviation license wasn't permanently revoked. Instead, he was required to complete extensive training and work with diversity programs before he could fly again. Punishment wasn't the goal, the tech leader explained. Change was the goal. And change requires learning, not just consequences. The young people watching this unfold saw something powerful. They saw that speaking up could lead to real change. They saw that one person's courage could inspire others to find their own courage. As the crowd dispersed that day, a veteran pilot stopped to talk to some of the aviation students. When I started flying 40 years ago, this industry looked very different, he said. Thanks to what happened here, it's going to look very different for you too. 1 year after the court case, the private aviation terminal looked very different. The same marble floors gleamed, but the people walking on them had changed. The staff was more diverse, the atmosphere more welcoming. But the biggest changes weren't the ones you could see. They were the ones you could feel. The tech leader had used the settlement money exactly as promised. She established a foundation dedicated to making aviation more accessible to everyone. The foundation's first project: a scholarship program for aspiring pilots from underrepresented backgrounds. I remember watching the news about that day in the terminal, said one of the first scholarship recipients. I was working as a baggage handler then, dreaming about flying but thinking it was impossible. Now I'm halfway through my pilot training. That moment changed everything for people like me. The young woman who'd worked at the coffee counter. She was now running the foundation's mentorship program. Her office sat right next to the terminal where it all began. Sometimes new students come in nervous, wondering if they really belong here, she shared. I tell them my story, and I watch their confidence grow. The training program developed after the court case became the industry standard. Airlines and private aviation companies across the country adopted it, not because they had to, but because they saw its value. The tech leader's software tracked the results. Reports of discrimination dropped by 70% in the first year alone. But perhaps the most surprising legacy came from an unexpected source. The pilot who'd caused the initial incident became one of the program's strongest advocates. After completing his sensitivity training and having his license reinstated, he chose to work with new pilots, sharing his story as a warning and a lesson. I was wrong, he would tell each new class. I let my biases blind me, and I almost lost everything I'd worked for. But more importantly, I was part of a system that hurt people. Being forced to face that changed me. Now I have a chance to help change others. The Tech Leaders Foundation didn't just focus on pilots. They created programs for flight attendants, mechanics, air traffic controllers, every part of the aviation world. They offered mentorship, training, and support to anyone who wanted to pursue a career in aviation. A wall in the foundation's office displayed photos of their successes. A young mechanic graduating top of her class. A group of student pilots earning their wings. A newly promoted air traffic controller. Each picture told the story of a barrier broken, a dream achieved. The industry magazines that once focused only on luxury and technical specs now regularly featured stories about diversity and inclusion. The Foundation's quarterly report became required reading for aviation executives. Companies started competing to show who could create the most welcoming environment. The coffee counter worker who'd been crying that day in court. She was now studying airport management, her tuition fully covered by the Foundation. I learned that speaking up matters, she said. One person's courage can give others courage too. Even the terminal itself had been transformed. The Foundation installed a small museum near the entrance, documenting the history of aviation. All of it this time, including the stories that had been left out before. School groups often visited, young faces pressed against the glass, seeing possibilities they'd never imagined. The best part, the tech leader said during the Foundation's first anniversary, isn't what we've done. It's what these young people will do. They'll take aviation places we never dreamed of because they won't be held back by the barriers we faced. The final photo on the Foundation's wall showed the tech leader standing with the first graduating class of scholarship recipients. Behind them was a new sign at the terminal entrance. The sky belongs to everyone.